This is the Destiny Well Lab Interpretation Guide for the Sleep Hormone Profile. I want to go over something complicated but extremely interesting and important about your hormones. It's called the steroidogenic pathways, and it shows how the major sex steroid hormones as well as your cortisol are closely interrelated and factors that lead from one pathway to the other and how these can influence the levels of the active hormones that you have in your system. We'll talk a little bit about the overview, and then to break it down, we'll go into separate diagrams of how cortisol is produced, what happens with the estrogen hormones, and what happens with the androgens like testosterone. It all starts with cholesterol. If you don't have enough cholesterol, you don't have enough precursors to make your hormones. And so people who take extremely strong cholesterol medicines, they're very sick, or they have very low cholesterol, they may not have enough precursor to make all the molecules they need. And subsequently, their cortisol may be low, or their estrogen and testosterone levels may end up low, affecting their overall well-being. So it starts with cholesterol, and that's converted into pregnenolone. Pregnenolone is the first of the sex-related steroid hormones, and it's a precursor hormone as well. Some of that goes to the hormone progesterone, which is much more common in higher doses in women, and that's important for different phases of the menstrual cycle, but it's also important for brain function and healing in both genders. Next, we'll go into how that turns into cortisol, how it turns into the estrogen hormone group, and how it turns into androgen or male-related testosterone group hormones separately in the next section. Cortisol is a key hormone. It's a life and death hormone. When you're stressed, when you're chased by a lion, when things are desperate in your life, then you make more cortisol. You're in a car accident, you have a heart attack, your body needs to mobilize everything for an emergency. That cranks up your cortisol. So cholesterol goes to pregnenolone and progesterone. Both of those lead to intermediate hormones, 17-hydroxypregnenolone and 17-hydroxyprogesterone. From there, they go to deoxycortisol and then to cortisol itself. Every cell in the body needs cortisol. In an emergency, it's great. It raises your blood sugar, it suppresses your immune system so that you use all of your capacity for flight or fight rather than building things. So it breaks down proteins, it breaks down sugar in storage forms, and it mobilizes you for an emergency, which in an emergency is a great thing. But when you don't have an emergency, when you have a situation where your body's interpreting it as an emergency in our modern culture, you don't get along with your boss, your job is stressful, you have financial difficulties, there's relationship issues or stress where you're living, and your body interprets that as an emergency, then you have sustained high levels of cortisol. Those sustained high levels can break down muscle, they can change the lining of the gut and the integrity of the gut membrane so that you have a leaky gut. They change the health and the character of the microbiome. They make areas of your brain like the hippocampus, which is important for short-term memory incorporation, they make those areas shrink. So an emergency on a long-term basis is not a good thing. But when your body perceives it's in trouble, it shunts as much cholesterol and as many precursors as possible into cortisol. Now cortisol has one other thing that can happen to it. It can get turned into the inactive cortisone form. Cortisone serves as a reservoir, and so people who have insulin resistance, they have VAT or visceral adipose tissue, fat around the middle, people with diabetes, folks like that are more likely to have high levels of cortisone. The cortisone serves as a reservoir, and so when cortisol goes down, it gets converted back from cortisone to keep it high. So people in that situation may have sustained higher levels of cortisol. So that's the pathway from cholesterol to your emergency hormone cortisol, which is important at moderate levels for function on a day-to-day basis and is used as an emergency situation hormone for things that come up. The first part of this pathway we're going to break down is the estrogen hormone part of the pathway. Again, things start with cholesterol, and they end up at three different estrogens: estrone, estradiol, and estriol. E2, or estradiol, is the strongest of these, the one that's the principal circulating hormone before menopause and is made in the ovaries by women. There's estrone, which is a weaker hormone, and there's estriol, which is also a weaker hormone that comes from estradiol as a less active metabolite. So it starts with cholesterol and goes to pregnenolone and to progesterone, As we said, progesterone is important in both men and women for function of the nervous system. It's helpful for sleep, and it helps with healing of tissues when they're injured. You can go to 17-hydroxypregnenolone or 17-hydroxyprogesterone. Both of those go to the weak androgens DHEA and androstenedione. DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone, is an androgenic molecule. It's one of the most common hormones in circulation. It's made by the adrenal glands, and it's a precursor made into a lot of other things. It peaks in around the 20s, and then as you get older, the levels gradually go down. Now, if you just take exogenous or external DHEA, it will improve your sense of well-being. It'll help muscle mass a little bit. There are receptors in the brain that respond to this. And so a lot of times people say, well, take some DHEA, it'll help you feel better. And it might. But the problem with pouring in a precursor molecule like DHEA is you never know where it's going to go. So you pour in a high dose of this. If you're a man, some of it may get metabolized into the estrogens, like estrone and through testosterone to estradiol. And if you're a woman, it may go into the testosterone pathway. So let's say you're a man, you take some DHEA initially, you get a high dose of that in your system, you get more well-being, you may make some more muscle and feel better. But if you metabolize a lot of it into estrogens, you may get some loss of muscle mass, you may get development of breast tissue, you may get changes in emotional situations and how you feel that you weren't expecting. The opposite is true in women, is if you pour in a bunch of DHEA, you probably will get some increased well-being. You might get a little bit of muscle boost, but additionally you can metabolize that into male hormones. And so if you increase your testosterone or some of the other androgens by doing that, you can get acne, you can get deepening of the voice, you can get other changes or even enlargement of the clitoral area. And so there are a lot of different things that can happen by messing with these precursors. So in general, cholesterol through the progesterone pathways go to the intermediates, and then they're converted to the weak estrogen estrone, and then through testosterone to estradiol. That's where most of it happens in the ovaries. It's directly produced as estradiol and released there. After menopause, estradiol comes from aromatization of some of the adrenal precursors, the DHEA and androstenedione, and so there is less of the estradiol and more of the E1 and E2 hormones following menopause. Now let's take a look at the testosterone or androgen side of the pathway. Again, it begins at cholesterol. Cholesterol has the ring structure that can be made into any of the steroid hormones. It always goes through pregnenolone. Pregnenolone is the initial sex steroid-related metabolite, and that can be turned into progesterone, into the estrogen family, or into the testosterone and androgens. So from pregnenolone, it can go to progesterone. Progesterone also has important functions in men in the neurologic tissues and also for healing. Both pregnenolone and progesterone have 17-hydroxy metabolites, so pregnenolone goes to 17-hydroxypregnenolone and progesterone goes to 17-hydroxyprogesterone. Those can be converted respectively into DHEA and into androstenedione. DHEA can go through intermediates into testosterone, and androstenedione can go directly to testosterone. So both of these pathways ultimately lead to testosterone. We've talked about DHEA as well having important roles. Both DHEA and androstenedione have testosterone-like effects, but they're much weaker, although they do circulate in high levels because they're some of the main hormones made by the adrenal gland, especially DHEA. It's a major precursor molecule. When we give DHEA from the outside, we get increased well-being because there are receptors in the brain that it fits into and helps with overall feeling and how you're doing. It also helps with muscle mass. But like we discussed previously, DHEA can go unpredictably into different pathways. It can end up as estrogens in men, and it can end up as testosterone in women. So the main pathway from cholesterol to testosterone is through the progesterone metabolites, through the weak androgens DHEA and androstenedione, to testosterone itself. Now let's look at these pathways put back together again. It all starts with cholesterol. So if your cholesterol level is too low, you may not be able to make enough cortisol or any of the sex steroid hormones. So we've set the norms at Destiny Well for our optimal zone at a range where you'll have enough cholesterol to make all of these hormone molecules. They go through the progesterones, and then it goes to cortisol when you need it. Now you need a bit of cortisol all the time, but if your body's either chronically stressed, you always perceive it's an emergency, or you really do go through serious emergencies like a car accident or a major surgery, then the body diverts massive amounts of cortisol on a sustained basis into the flight or fight mode. So it'll take all those precursors and shunt things down to cortisol. That's called the cortisol steal. You take everything you have, you put it into life or death reactions. That leaves a lot less molecules to get turned into the estrogens and into testosterone. So your sexual function, your sexual development, your ability to reproduce, all of those go down substantially when it's a life and death situation. So the more we can send our signals for life and death just when there are emergencies rather than all the time from chronic stress, the better and healthier our other hormone pathways will be. If you have a lot of inflammation in your system, then in women, that turns on the 1720 lyase pathway and converts progesterone into androgen metabolites and testosterone. That's what happens in things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, where the 1720 lyase is turned on. That's turned on by things like insulin resistance and abnormal glucose metabolism. And then it's also true that in men, when there's insulin resistance and obesity and visceral adipose around the middle, fat tissue around the belly, that the aromatase enzyme is turned on. That converts testosterone into the most active estrogen, E2 estradiol. And so men then get estrogen type effects when they're stressed from turning on the aromatase. So overall, we can see these pathways are very closely interrelated. How our stress is, how our precursors are, how the balance in our life is, as well as our glucose metabolism and our body habitus. All these play together to determine the balance of hormones we have and our overall state of health. At Destiny Well, we define laboratory ranges in a sophisticated way. We use the standard ranges, represented by the blue bar here, from each reference lab that does a particular test to define the lab high and the lab low. If you have thyroid test results that are too low based on the lab's formal norm, then you have a diagnosis of lab low thyroid function or hypothyroidism. Similarly, for glucose, if you have a lab high blood sugar of over 126 on 2 occasions, then you meet the formal diagnosis criteria for diabetes. That's needed to make a medical diagnosis. But at Destiny Well, we think that there can be a lot more nuance. We believe that there's often an optimal range based on what we've found going forward helps people to live the healthiest lives, to be the healthiest, and to avoid disease. We triangulate this with the medical literature, with other people's standards, with our clinical practice experience, and all the different data points we can get, so we can come up with what we believe is optimal for a particular test result. Destiny Well also, in the red bars here, will define a Destiny Well high and a Destiny Well low. These may or may not line up exactly with a laboratory high or low, because sometimes we think that the range can be higher or lower, or that it needs to be different. And in between the optimal and the green bar and the low and the high in the red bars, we have orange zones for moderately high and moderately low. They're not quite optimal, but they're not in the high or low zone. Urinary cortisol levels tend to lag from serum and salivary cortisol levels by a few hours, since it takes a while for the kidneys to excrete them, and then they sit in the bladder for a while. The normal laboratory range for our reference lab for morning urinary cortisol is 7.8 micrograms per gram of creatinine on the low end and 29.5 micrograms per gram of creatinine on the high end. We believe the optimal green zone is 11 to 23, mildly low 7.8 to 9.9, and low less than 7.8. We think 23.1 to 29.5 is mildly elevated, and over 29.5 is too high. Since cortisol is so critical for life on a day-to-day basis, it tends not to go down as we age, but it does have a strong day cycle rhythm. Over the course of 24 hours, if you're on a normal sleep cycle, sleeping at night, waking up in the morning, it bottoms out around 3 a.m. and then rapidly peaks somewhere just around or before 8 a.m. Then it goes down as the day goes on to be lower in the afternoon, getting you ready for sleep, and higher in the morning, activating things and raising your blood sugar, getting you ready for the day. On the previous chart, you could see the cortisol peaks in the morning around 8 a.m., goes down by noon, goes down further in the afternoon, and then it bottoms out late at night into the wee hours of the morning. That's the normal diurnal or day cycle pattern of cortisol. On this chart, you can see the ranges for different times of day. You can see that the highest ranges are in the morning, and then it goes down in parallel with the graph. A Canadian physiologist by the name of Hans Selye described many years ago what he called the general adaptation response. It's the stages that the HPA, or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that regulates the cortisol and DHEA production from the adrenal glands, go through in their adaptation to chronic response. We mostly tell what stage people are in by measuring the cortisols at different times of day and also by checking their DHEA level. In the normal stress response, the person is calm, healthy, and energetic. Their baseline cortisol goes up in the morning to get the body ready and to raise the blood sugar and to get ready for the day. It then goes down a good bit by noon and continues to fall in the afternoon and then bottoms in the middle of the night, only to start that cycle over again in the morning with peak cortisols to get you ready for the next day. The DHEA levels would be expected to be normal then. In the early phase of the chronic HPA stress response, we see that the total cortisol output is high, and one or more readings are actually high. The DHEA can be normal or it can be low. It will typically show that the cortisol levels on several readings are higher than the expected range. When we move into the mid stage of chronic HPA axis stress response, we see a different pattern. Total cortisol is normal. Cortisol is low in the morning and noon or afternoon, and then it goes up either in the late afternoon or evening. So it's sort of a reverse pattern. These people often have a lot of trouble sleeping, and their DHEA is frequently low. Then in the final late stage of chronic HPA stress response, the exhaustion phase, we see that the total cortisol is low all day long and the DHEA is low. This may be lower than the normal range throughout the entire day. Now, when people have lab high cortisols, we worry that they could have Cushing's disease, and they may actually need further tests to make sure that they don't have a syndrome where the body's producing too much cortisol, and in that case, they may have things like abnormal accumulation of fat around the shoulders, development of red moon face, development of high blood pressure and diabetes. And even more acutely life-threatening is people who have truly low cortisols. They may have what's called Addison's disease. And if you have Addison's, you can't put out enough cortisol in response to stress. So if you get in a car accident or have pneumonia or a heart attack, you may not be able to put out enough cortisol and you could die suddenly. So when the values are lab high or lab low for cortisol, the first thing to do is to make sure someone doesn't have either Addison's disease if it's low or Cushing's disease if it's high. And then if those are ruled out, then we worry about what's their chronic stress adaptation response and how can we help modulate that. In the initial part of this presentation, we discussed about the difference between cortisol and cortisone at the bottom of the steroidogenic pathway. Cortisone is an inactive form of cortisol. It has to be reconverted to cortisol to have steroid-like effects. Cortisone tends to build up when there's an increase in insulin resistance, prediabetes, and conditions related to that. It serves as a reservoir to keep the cortisol level high, even though it's not active itself. In this profile, we measure 4 times a day cortisol, but also 4 times a day cortisone. So symptoms of too much cortisol when you get Cushing's disease are red, round, flushed face, elevated blood pressure, thinning of the bones and osteoporosis, elevated blood sugars or diabetes, purple stretch marks or stria on the skin look the same that many women get with pregnancy, mood swings and anxiety, rapid weight gain in the face, chest, abdomen, and with thin arms and legs, and often with a buildup of fat in the upper central shoulders. These people will often have increased thirst and frequent urination. Symptoms of too little cortisol, Addison's disease, include fatigue, dizziness, especially dizziness on standing, a lot of nausea, weight loss, muscle weakness, mood changes, and then darkening of the skin. They may get an actual bronze type color that's even different than you get with an intense suntan. In relation to sleep disorders, by far the most common cause of low melatonin is the aforementioned increase in cortisol. High cortisols tend to be the opposite of low melatonin. When one of these is up, the other is generally down. So usually melatonin goes up in the late evening and during the night, and cortisol is at an absolute low level between midnight and 3 a.m. The most common cause of abnormal cortisol is dysglycemia or blood sugar issues. Sleep deprivation or inadequate sleep quality leads to a number of problems. It can cause depression, it can cause decreased function, and certain illnesses such as migraine and even cardiovascular disease risk can go up. Most people need 7 to 8 hours of good quality sleep. Some people, especially younger adults, may need 9 hours of sleep. There's a normal circadian pattern with melatonin going up at night and then down in the morning, and cortisol going up in the morning and down at night. Usually these two are inverse of each other. Fascinating research has shown that when people don't get enough sleep, they haven't slept for 17 to 19 hours, that's the equivalent of having a blood alcohol level of 0.05. In most states, DUI, or driving under the influence, is at 0.08. Commercial drivers have a blood alcohol limit of 0.04. If you've not slept for 24 hours, then your blood alcohol equivalent is 0.10. So you can see that reaction time, mental processing, and a number of other things really decrease when you're not getting adequate sleep. We want to give you a good look at your sleep pattern here with your melatonin, cortisol, and cortisone levels so that you can get a handle on how your body is reacting and responding. The graphs of urinary-free cortisol, urinary-free cortisone, and urinary melatonin show the patterns that we usually expect. Cortisol and cortisone peak in the morning, but a little after serum values do, because it takes a while for the cortisol to be filtered into the urine, and the same for the cortisone, and show up. The urinary melatonin similarly has a lag, but it tends to peak in the late evening and then go down throughout the day, and then about 6 p.m. it starts to go back up again. In this table, we see the pattern of urinary-free cortisol, urinary-free cortisone, which parallel each other, and urinary melatonin. You can see that there is a lag period. Typically, serum and salivary cortisol peak around 8 a.m. or a little before or after. The urinary cortisol, it's the second morning value that's the highest, and the same for the cortisone. This happens because it takes a while for the cortisol and cortisone to be filtered out by the kidneys, concentrated in the urine, and then excreted through the bladder. Melatonin has a similar lag. Melatonin starts to go up in the evening and is highest in the late evening and early part of the night. Then it goes down. But the first morning melatonin tends to be the highest, and then the second morning the second highest. So this is also a lag from what we would see if we were measuring serum melatonin levels. When we look at first morning urinary melatonin, we see a laboratory reference range of 18 micrograms per gram of creatinine on the low end and 40.9 micrograms per gram of creatinine on the high end. At Destiny Well, we've set our optimal zone at 18 to 40.9 because there's less data on urinary optimal based on how much research there is using urinary melatonins. However, we would say that some of this will depend on whether your sleep cycle is shifted backward or forward and the relationship between your cortisol levels to see how things are in sync. So for different individuals, what's ideal might vary. Two important things happen when you don't get enough sleep. It's difficult to lose weight, and people often gain weight when they're not getting adequate sleep. Also, testosterone levels are dependent upon adequate sleep. So if you want to raise your testosterone levels, try to get 7 or 8 hours of good sleep every night. The lab tests included in the Destiny Well sleep profile include 4 specimens throughout the day at specific times for each of these hormones: cortisol, cortisone, and melatonin. The Destiny Well sleep profile can be of great value because it shows you the interrelationship between stress, sleep, and how you're handling your stress. It can also give you information on how your circadian rhythms are set that regulate your day and night cycles to see how these are synchronized. At Destiny Well, we've been extremely fortunate to find some amazingly good coaches, people with backgrounds of success in varied fields who bring all sorts of resources and talent and skill to help you. These folks have many years of clinical experience, and they know how to be of assistance at every step of the way, from motivation to connecting you with the right resources to finding things that you need to get you on your journey. To learn more, go to destinywell.com/coaching to meet our team and find out how they can be of service to you.